What happens when the world's friendliest border turns into a fault line? When policy becomes pressure, pressure becomes tariffs, and tariffs become prices you feel in your grocery run, your car payment, your mortgage, and your job prospects. That's the question hanging over North America right now as talk of new US tariffs aimed at Canada, especially Ontario's manufacturing heartland, accelerates from speculation to a real economic risk.
Yeah.
And whether you live in Toronto or Toledo, Windsor, or Warren, the ripple effects could arrive at your door faster than you think. Here's the big picture. The United States and Canada are each other's closest economic partners.
Yeah.
Every day, more than $2 billion in goods and services cross the border. A single car assembled in the Great Lakes region can cross that border multiple times before it rolls off the line. Wheat, beef, softwood lumber, chemicals, electricity, oil, software, movies, medical equipment. The supply chain is so integrated that made in America and made in Canada are often two chapters of the same story. And yet that integration is precisely what makes tariff threats so powerful. You don't have to shut down a factory to bring it to its knees. You just have to jam one step in the chain and the whole machine starts to sputter. This week, the message from Washington has been sharp tariffs are a tool, and the administration is willing to use them to rewrite terms it sees as unfair. The target list under discussion, according to multiple public statements and reporting just familiar pressure points, autos and components, steel and aluminum, and possibly a slate of consumer-facing goods designed to maximize political impact. The emphasis on Ontario is not accidental. Ontario is Canada's manufacturing engine, home to automakers, parts suppliers, steel mills, plastics, glass, food processing, and a web of small and mid-sized firms that feed into bigger U.S. operations just across the lakes. If your strategy is leverage, that's where you apply it. Canada's response has been equally clear. Retaliation would be immediate, calibrated, and consistent with the North American trade deal. Ottawa's playbook is well worn after the 2018 steel and aluminum showdown. You build a retaliation list that hits iconic products in politically sensitive U.S. states. You rally governors and industry groups who depend on Canadian inputs. You press the case through dispute settlement rules, and you signal openness to de-escalation if tariffs are lifted. It's not a brawl Canada wants, it's a deterrence strategy. But if the tariffs land, so will the counterpunch. Let's unpack what tariffs actually do in a North American context. Tariffs are taxes at the border. They raise the cost of imported goods. That cost is usually shared somewhere along the line. Exporters absorb some, importers absorb some, consumers pay some, and sometimes the currency shifts to offset a slice of it. But here's the twist with Canada and the USA. A lot of ports are really domestic supply chains that cross a line on the map. Imagine a Windsor parts maker that ships a transmission case to Detroit, where it's machined and married to a gearbox, then sent back to Ontario for assembly, then to Ohio for final testing. A tariff on the first leg cascades across all of them. It's a tax you pay 3 or 4 times on a single product, or it forces companies to re-engineer an entire process in weeks that took decades to refine. Autos are the most obvious flashpoint. The region's vehicle ecosystem supports millions of direct and indirect jobs. Tariffs on parts raise the cost of finished vehicles. Tariffs on finished vehicles reduce margins and constrain model choices. And even the hint of tariffs can freeze decision-making. Automakers delay launches, suppliers hold off on hiring, and logistics teams start sketching costly workarounds. For workers, that can mean fewer overtime shifts, more temporary layoffs, and a wave of uncertainty that strains families well before any official announcement is made. Steel and aluminum are next in line. In 2018, those tariffs were pitched as a national security measure. The intended beneficiaries were U.S. metals producers. Some of them did see better pricing, but downstream manufacturers, everything from appliance makers to defense subcontractors, faced higher input costs and unpredictable delivery times. Canada retaliated then with a carefully targeted list that included U.S. steel, aluminum, and a basket of consumer goods designed to get the attention of lawmakers. The dispute ended when the two sides negotiated. If you've seen this movie before, you know the beats: sudden shock, price spikes, supply chain scramble, and eventually a handshake. The question is whether this time the ending looks the same or whether tariffs become a more permanent feature. Softwood lumber is a quiet, persistent thorn. For decades, lumber duties have been a cyclical headache for home builders and homeowners. Duties go up, the price of framing timber rises, and new home construction and the cost of renovations follows. In a high interest rate environment, any added cost to home building is felt acutely. If the new tariff push sweeps lumber into the frame, that's another pressure point on housing affordability, especially in markets already stretched thin. Then there's agriculture and food. Dairy is always contentious. Canada's supply management system limits imports, and U.S. producers want more access. Tariffs can boomerang quickly here. If Ottawa responds by targeting iconic U.S. farm exports, the pain lands in swing states fast. Retaliation during past disputes went after products like ketchup, yogurt, and other brand name staples that are easy for consumers to boycott and easy for headlines to amplify. The goal is not to punish shoppers. It's to make the political staff in key districts pick up the phone. Energy and electricity are less headline grabbing, but just as crucial. Oil and refined products crisscross the border through pipelines and rails. The power grids are interconnected. Ontario imports electricity from the U.S., peak times, and exports at others. Natural gas flows back and forth. Tariffs here are trickier because the costs can be buried in complex contracts. The principle is straightforward. Friction at the border raises costs, and those costs show up in utility bills and fuel prices. Even if energy products avoid the tariff list, related equipment, parts, and services might not, creating downstream pressures. There's a political theater component too. Trade disputes are as much about messaging as they are about economics. This week, messaging in the U.S. leaned into strength and fairness, framing tariffs as a tool to demand better deals, revive domestic manufacturing, and speak to workers who feel globalization didn't deliver for them. Some of the advertising circulating evokes a retro confidence, tapping into nostalgia for a time when the economic playbook felt simpler and industrial jobs felt more secure. Canada's counter message emphasizes neighborliness, reliability, and shared prosperity. You don't undercut your ally when your supply chains and security commitments are inseparable. How do the rules constrain and enable this fight? The North American Trade Agreement includes dispute settlement mechanisms. Canada can challenge U.S. tariffs and seek relief through a panel. There are carve-outs the U.S. can lean on. Certain actions justified under national security or trade remedy laws give Washington latitude. The interplay between domestic laws that authorize tariffs and the regional pact is a legal chessboard. Win or lose, these cases take time. Markets don't wait. Companies must plan based on what might happen, not what a panel might eventually rule. Timing matters for another reason. The agreement includes a formal review in 2026. That looming date is a lever. One way to force issues onto the agenda is to create urgency now. If Washington wants concessions on digital taxes, dairy access, pharmaceutical IP rules, autos rules of origin, or critical minerals content, tariffs become both a threat and an invitation. Let's talk, but let's talk on my terms. Ottawa, in turn, can use retaliation lists and coalition building with U.S. governors and companies to reshape those terms. That coalition is powerful. Look at a map of American states for which Canada is the top export market. It's most of them: Michigan, Ohio, Pennsylvania, New York, Illinois, Wisconsin. These states are heavily interlinked with Ontario. Mayors, county executives, chambers of commerce, and unions all have something to lose. In 2018, it was letters from Republican and Democratic governors, the testimony of small factory owners, and the logistics chiefs at the biggest automakers who helped unwind the tariffs. Expect that pressure to reappear quickly if tariffs bite. The most persuasive argument might not be philosophical. It might be a spreadsheet from a company in Indiana showing how a 10% tariff on a Canadian input destroys the margins on a product they sell to the Pentagon or to a hospital system. Currency is the underappreciated variable. When the U.S. imposes tariffs, the Canadian dollar often weakens. A weaker loonie makes Canadian exports cheaper in U.S. dollars, offsetting part of the tariff. But it also makes Canadian imports, especially machinery and high-tech equipment, more expensive for Canadian buyers, potentially slowing investment north of the border. For U.S. consumers, the net effect tends to be higher prices on affected goods. For central bankers watching inflation, that's a headache they don't want. Small businesses feel the blows first. Think of a tool and die shop in Windsor that ships 3 times a week to Metro Detroit. They operate on thin margins. Their customers pay net 30 or net 60, and their cash flow absorb weeks of uncertainty or surprise duties. Or a family-run food processor in upstate New York that depends on Canadian packaging and ingredients routed through Ontario. For cross-border truckers, delays at customs and new paperwork are time lost, and time is money. Border communities like Sault Ste. Marie or Buffalo, Niagara live and die by predictability. Tariff-era border slowdowns turn predictable days into coin tosses. Workers, too, carry the weight. The pitch for tariffs is often framed as a defense of jobs. But in a supply chain economy, the line between protecting jobs in one sector and risking jobs in another is thin. Steelworkers and smelter towns hear opportunity. Tier 2 auto suppliers, appliance assemblers, and construction crews hear worry. Unions on both sides of the border must thread a needle, support domestic investment and fair trade, yes. Avoid new shocks that lead to layoffs or automation that never reverses. Now, zoom out to strategy. If you're sitting in the West Wing, tariffs are leverage. You count on 3 dynamics. First, Canada is a good faith player that doesn't want the fight, so they'll talk. Second, domestic audiences reward tough talk on trade, especially in regions where manufacturing jobs are political gold. Third, Mexico's presence in the pact means there's a triangulation element. Pressure on Canada might yield concessions across the whole North American table. From auto content rules to energy and environmental standards. If you're in Ottawa, your strategy is resilience. You keep the alliance stitched together, NORAD in defense, critical minerals collaboration, supply chain security for semiconductors, cross-border cyber cooperation. You practice escalation control, make retaliation painful enough to force reconsideration. Not so broad that it spirals. Use legal mechanisms to buy time, knowing companies hate uncertainty and will lobby for stability. And you cultivate U.S. voices who can face the cameras and say, tariffs on Canada hurt my constituents. That message lands differently than a Canadian minister wagging a finger. Where could this go? There are 3 broad scenarios. 1, high noise, low action. Tariffs are floated, maybe even announced, but exemptions carve outs, quotas blunt the impact quickly. The administration declares victory. Canada claims the system worked, and the 2 sides reset with new side agreements on contentious sectors. 2, a limited clash. A targeted set of goods get tariffs. Ottawa hits back with a mirrored list. Prices on specific categories rise, supply chains reroute around the pain points, and both sides talk their bases through the storm while quietly negotiating. 3, a broader trade fight. Tariffs expand, legal challenges multiply, and investment decisions shift. The fallout becomes a central business story for months with real macroeconomic consequences in both countries. Signals to watch will tell you which path we're on. Look for the legal justification the U.S. chooses. National security measures allow quicker action. Other trade remedy laws take longer. Watch whether the product list includes parts as well as finished goods. Parts tariffs are a tell for deep supply chain disruption. Pay attention to the speed and breadth of Canada's retaliation list. The more surgical, the more it's a deterrent rather than an invitation to escalate. And listen for governors from border states and the industrial Midwest. If they start pressing for exemptions within days, that's a sign the feedback loop is working. There's also an information war layered on top. In the U.S., messaging frames tariffs as a course correction, a tool to reshore jobs, pressure partners, and reset a status quo seen as lopsided. Ads and speeches try to make economic nationalism feel like common sense, tying it to a legacy of toughness and prosperity. In Canada, officials and business groups stress interdependence and the risks of self-harm, reminding Americans that their supply chains, their military procurement, and their price stability depend on frictionless trade with the country that not only shares a border, but values and strategic priorities. None of this means the grievances aren't real. The U.S. has long argued that Canada's market access in dairy is too tight, that lumber markets are distorted, that digital taxation could unfairly target U.S. tech firms, and that rules of origin in autos should be stricter. Canada has counter grievances, persistent U.S. subsidies by American rules that sideline Canadian firms despite integrated supply chains, and episodic tariffs used as bargaining chips. Tariffs are one way to bring those arguments to a head. They're just a particularly blunt one. Critical minerals and EVs are a fresh flashpoint. North America is racing to build batteries, secure lithium, nickel, cobalt, and graphite supplies and reshape the auto industry for electric platforms. Ontario has bet big on EV assembly and components with U.S. partners built into almost every project. Tariffs that complicate parts flows or content rules threaten to slow that build out. At the same time, champions of tariffs argue that short-term pain yields long-term capacity, forcing companies to invest inside the tariff wall. Whether that actually happens depends on scale, timing, and predictability. Investors can handle risk. They hate whiplash. Then there's the human side, less quantifiable, more palpable. Picture a shift supervisor at a stamping plant in Oshawa hearing rumblings about tariffs on the line. It's the second time in a decade the ground has moved under their feet. Or a supplier in suburban Detroit who spent years building a relationship with a partner in Kitchener, now redoing invoices and delivery schedules because an overnight rule change made Tuesday's shipment uneconomical. That's the real cost of policy by surprise. The energy spent untying knots instead of making better products. Some argue tariffs are a negotiation tactic, not a destination. Deploy them, extract concessions, stand down. It's a view backed by precedent. The last major scrap ended with tariffs lifted in exchange for monitoring and side deals clearing the way for the new trade agreement. Others worry that a steady normalization of tariffs recalibrates expectations permanently, raising a tax on the North American economy that consumers pay without fully noticing. Neither view is guaranteed. Policy is choice, not fate. So what should you watch for tomorrow, next week, next month? If the administration announces a formal investigation or invokes national security, a clock starts. You'll see industry groups flood the with comments. Financial markets will reprice companies exposed to cross-border flows. Steel producers may jump while automakers and consumer durables wobble. If Canada publishes a draft retaliation list within hours, that's a signal it wants to shape the conversation, not just react to it. If lawmakers in key states start asking for carve-outs tied to local employers, expect exemptions to follow. And if both sides keep referencing the upcoming review of the North American Pact, consider that the bigger negotiation has already begun. Could this all be diffused quickly? Absolutely. There's ample room for face saving. Exemptions for allies, quota systems instead of tariffs, accelerated dispute resolution on dairy or lumber, clearer rules on digital taxation, and deepened cooperation on critical minerals could all be packaged as a win-win. in a region where trucks, data, energy, and family ties flow as easily as the water through the Great Lakes. There's a built-in incentive to fix problems fast, but it would be a mistake to dismiss the stakes. Tariffs aren't just lines on a spreadsheet. They are price tags on trust. They tell your neighbor, your supplier, your workers, and your allies what kind of partner you intend to be in a world where supply chains are already strained by wars, pandemics, and geopolitics. Adding self-inflicted friction with your closest ally is a choice that carries real costs. As this story develops, remember three truths. First, the US and Canada don't just trade with each other, they build things together. Unraveling that is harder than it sounds and riskier than it looks. Second, politics explains a lot of this. Who gets helped, who gets squeezed, and when the pressure eases, follow the politics and you'll often predict the policy. Third, there's a path back to stability. It runs through quiet rooms, spreadsheets, legal texts, and the voices of people whose livelihoods depend on trucks rolling across bridges without surprises. If you work in an industry that touches the border, even indirectly, now is the time to scenario plan. What happens if your key input gets a 10% duty? How quickly can you reroute? Can you lock in supply at today's prices? Who are your contacts across the border? And are you aligned on paperwork, delivery windows, and contingency plans? And if you're a consumer, the best advice is simple: expect some prices to bump. Be skeptical of anyone who tells you it will all be painless, and keep an eye on which products become bargaining chips. The story isn't finished. It's a negotiation with high stakes and moving parts. Will leverage yield concessions and a handshake? Will Canada's retaliation list force a rethink? Will governors and CEOs carry the day? Or are we headed for a longer, costlier standoff that resets what normal looks like for North American trade? We'll be watching every statement, every list, and every exemption, because in a border region where a part can cross 3 times before lunch, sometimes the smallest rule change is the loudest alarm bell. If you value clear, calm analysis on stories like this, stick around. Keep cutting through the noise, tracking the details that matter, and following the money to the truth of who wins, who loses, and what it means for your wallet and your work. Right. And as always, I want to hear from you. If you're in manufacturing, trucking, farming, construction, or retail on either side of the border, what are you seeing and feeling on the ground? Drop a comment with your perspective, because the best view of a policy's impact is from the people living it day to day. Until then, remember, in geopolitics, neighbors are destiny. When Washington and Ottawa argue that the echoes don't stop at the border, they bounce around the factory floor. Checkout line and the family budget. Let's hope the next echo sounds more like a compromise than a collision.